Good morning. I am Dr. Lee Brown, Interim Provost and Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs at Fayetteville State University. And on behalf of our Chancellor, Dr. Peggy Valentine, our hundreds of faculty and staff, and our more than 6,700 students, it is truly an honor and a pleasure to welcome you to Fayetteville State University. As a true community partner and our rich tradition of collaboration with our community outside the campus gates, we are extremely thrilled to host this event today. In fact, criminal justice and its associated majors and concentrations, such as pre-law, forensic sciences, cybersecurity, etc., are some of the most popular majors we have on campus today, and some of the most impactful students on our campus today. We have Broncos making significant contributions to society, from probation officers to police officers, from forensic accountants to detectives, from lawyers to judges. This gives us such a tremendous amount of Bronco pride. Today's challenges needs forums like this. Not only forums like this, but they need more professionals like you who are dedicated, compassionate, and committed to excellence. And we as a university community are extremely proud to play a small role in meeting those challenges and hosting this event today. So thank you and welcome.
Good morning. I'm Secretary Erik with the North Carolina Department of Public Safety. I'm grateful for the participation in this important virtual forum today, partnering with our communities. Thank you, Dr. Brown, for providing this tremendous venue to bring us together today. I'm especially pleased we're having this forum at our historic Fayetteville State University. Having grown up just down the road from here in Spring Lake, and having a number of family members who attended this fine institution, it's always good to be home. In fact, two of my senior leaders in the Department of Public Safety, Jane Ammons-Gilchrist and Chief Deputy Secretary Pam Cashwell, also grew up in the Fayetteville area. So it's a bit of a homecoming for several of us. In June of this year, Governor Cooper signed Executive Order 145, which established the North Carolina Task Force for Racial Equity in Criminal Justice. It is chaired by North Carolina Attorney General Josh Stein and North Carolina Supreme Court Associate Justice Anita Earls. I, in turn, volunteered to chair the working group on policing policy and practice. Fayetteville Mayor Mitch Colvin, in fact, also is a member of the task force and chairs another one of the working groups as well. The executive order also moved the Department of Public Safety forward with creating a paid internship program with special emphasis on HBCUs, so we can recruit a workforce reflective of the entire community. I'm pleased to acknowledge that we have a Fayetteville State University student as part of our paid internship program. The executive order also tasked the Department of Public Safety to host a singular forum for interaction between law enforcement and communities of color, to promote positive relationships and to work together to create a safer North Carolina. I'm proud that we're actually doing two this year. The first one was at Winston-Salem State. The second forum brings us to Fayetteville State University. I have publicly acknowledged that there's a great deal of pain in our communities, in our state, and across our nation. This pain did not begin in Minneapolis with the unnecessary and tragic death of Mr. George Floyd. The pain has been long-standing in many communities across our country. But it is through this pain, America must examine disparities and divides while promoting healing and reconciliation. This journey that we're on is extremely personal to me. When it comes to race, there are still too many times that society has prejudged people who look like me. Likewise, we all can be guilty of failing to love one another as we have loved ourselves. But let me tell you a little bit more about this journey. This journey, like Dr. King's description of the arc of the moral universe, is long, but it bends toward justice. So I remain hopeful, and I still believe law enforcement is a great and noble profession. The highest ethical standards have to govern every aspect of law enforcement and our criminal justice system. And true justice demands equal treatment for all racial and ethnic groups. Those of us who are truly committed to public safety must continue to uphold that sacred trust placed in us by our communities. And it is also confirmed by our oaths to support and protect all communities we serve. Our mission at DPS is accomplished through effective law enforcement, emergency response, homeland security and military preparedness, and other public safety measures. As we seek to create and maintain a true culture of preparedness, protection, and prevention, we must have the trust of all communities. I'm a firm believer public safety officials must constantly strive not only to navigate communities, but to be a vital part of those communities. Therefore, engaging and maximizing opportunities to bring together diverse talents for the benefit of all communities. We must maintain intentional partnerships and engage critical stakeholders, such as we're doing today, for the needed collaboration in all our communities to create a safer North Carolina. We have an outstanding panel today who will lend their considered perspectives on racial equity and community partnerships. I'm grateful to our faith-based community leaders, higher education partners, and community leaders at large for joining our law enforcement professionals in this forum today. I'll now turn it over to the Director of Communications for the Department of Public Safety, Pam Walker, who will serve as our moderator today. Pamela?
Thank you, sir. Good morning. Thank you all for being here today and joining us in on this forum. Thank you also, Dr. Brown, Mr. Secretary, for your messaging and telling us why we're here today. What a beautiful campus and facility. Very honored to be here today and honored to have all of you here with us. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce all of our panelists and give a brief bio on each of the panelists. We will then go into conversation that will last approximately 1 hour, and then we'll take a break, and then after that we'll open it up to the public to see if there are people out there that have questions that they want to ask all of you. So I'm first going to introduce Mr. Kevin Brooks. He's sitting right here. He is a community representative and humanitarian. Mr. Brooks is the owner and operator of 1225 Traces located in Fayetteville. He has been a professional barber for 25 years and is also the founder and director of The Group Theory, Inc., a 501c3 not-for-profit foundation that hosts community events such as Gotcha Back School Kickoff, providing young students a backpack and school supplies for many, many years. He has served on a variety of boards and commissions and is currently serving as the Youth Committee Chair for Workforce Development. Earlier this year, the Fayetteville Cumberland Human Relations Commission awarded Mr. Brooks with the Humanitarian Award at its annual Community Awards reception. On my right is Dr. Sherree R.B. Davis. Dr. Davis is the director of the Office of Civic Engagement and Service Learning here at Fayetteville State University. She also teaches various courses in the Department of Criminal Justice. She has a bachelor's degree from Hampton University and obtained her master's and doctorate degrees from the George Washington University. Her research has focused on crisis intervention of university students experiencing mental health concerns, the impact of online education, juvenile justice, and community corrections. She has received such awards as the Department of Criminal Justice Outstanding Teacher of the Year Award, the Fayetteville State University Public Service Award, and the Institute of Community Leadership Certificate of Achievement. To my left here in the middle is Assistant Chief Anthony Kelly with the Fayetteville Police Department. Chief Kelly commands the Specialized Services Bureau, which is comprised of various units in training and professional development, field operations support, the Community Resource Division, Specialized Operations, Central Records, and the Technical Support Division. Chief Kelly has been with the Fayetteville Police Department since 1995 and risen through the ranks from patrol officer to sergeant to lieutenant to captain to assistant chief to interim chief. Chief Kelly holds a Bachelor of Science in Criminal Justice from Fayetteville State University. He graduated from the West Point Leadership Program held at Methodist University and the FBI National Academy. Over here to my right in the second chair is Colonel Glenn McNeill, Jr., the Highway Patrol Commander. Governor Cooper appointed Colonel Glenn McNeill, Jr. as Commander of the State Highway Patrol in February of 2017. A military veteran, McNeill began his service as a state trooper in 1994. During his law enforcement career, he has served in various positions, including the Special Operations Section, as the troop commander, and upon his promotion to major, as Director of Training, with oversight of the State Highway Patrol Training Academy. McNeill was responsible for all aspects of training. A native of Reidsville, McNeill holds an associate's degree from Durham Technical Community College, a bachelor's degree from Mount Olive College, and graduate certificates from the University of Virginia. He is also a graduate of the Administrative Officers Management Program and the National Academy at the Federal Bureau of Investigation in Quantico, Virginia. To my left over here in this chair is Major Dennis Peterson with the Cumberland County Sheriff's Office. Major Peterson is a member of the command staff as the Sheriff's Office Operations Commander. He is a native of Virginia. He retired from the United States Army with his last assignment being at the Army Intelligence and Security Command, Fort Bragg. He served honorably for 22 years. He attended classes to further his education at the University of Maryland, Pemberton, Texas State University during his military career. And before retiring from the Army, he decided to pursue a career in law enforcement, getting his basic law enforcement training at Fayetteville Technical Community College. He has held many positions all across the Sheriff's Office. He has received many awards and decorations and has received the Advanced Law Enforcement Certificate and Advanced Service Award. Over here in this middle chair is Pastor Mark Anthony Rowden. Pastor Rowden is an author, professor, and founder of Mark Rowden Ministry International, Inc., based in Fayetteville, a global ministry of outreach, restoring families, and empowering God's people. He is the author of the book, The Ministry of Missions. He is a Texas native. Reverend Rowden retired from the United States Army with his last assignment being at the United States Military Headquarters, Pentagon, Washington, D.C. He served honorably for 23 years. Reverend Rowden received a Bachelor's of Theology from Zoe University, Jacksonville, Florida, Bachelor's of Sociology from Fayetteville State University, Master of Divinity and Doctorate from the North Carolina Theological Seminary. He has served on many boards and committees across the city and the county. He has served as a community liaison for Cumberland County Schools and led the clergy efforts in forming Clergy to Stop the Violence in Fayetteville, and led Fayetteville's first ever gun buyback, removing over 250 weapons off of the streets of Fayetteville. Pastor Rowden is the recipient of the 2014 Religious Leader of the Year Award presented by the Fayetteville Cumberland County Human Relations Commission. He is a servant leader of Savannah Missionary Baptist Church of Fayetteville since January of 2002. And lastly is Director Bob Schurmeier with the State Bureau of Investigation. Director Schurmeier was sworn in as the director of the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation in July of 2016. He grew up in Charlotte and later attended UNC Chapel Hill. After graduating with a bachelor's degree in political science, Director Schurmeier joined the Charlotte Police Department. That agency later became the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department in 1993. Schurmeier spent 21 years in the upper command ranks of CMPD. He served as Deputy Chief of Police and also served as Interim Chief. He gained experience in all 4 major commands of the department. He has more than 3,000 hours of law enforcement training. He is a graduate of the Senior Management Institute for Police, the FBI National Academy, and the Secret Service Dignitary Protection School. And after a full career with CMPD, he co-founded USISS Agency, LLC, a security and investigative consulting business in Charlotte before he became the director of the SBI. Okay, so we have our panel, and we're now going to launch into one of the first questions I have for each of you is, could you please give us a brief preview of how your organization is encouraging community law enforcement partnerships? I'm going to start with you, Dr. Davis.
Okay, thank you. Good morning again. First I have to say thank you to Governor Cooper for having the foresight and vision and recognizing that this is a critical issue that we're here to talk about today in this conversation. Also thank my university, because one thing I'd like to say is that Fayetteville State University is demonstrating its commitment to this issue, to involvement in the community, by even hosting the forum we have here today. That is just one step. I am in a position where I wear multiple hats. I'm in a unique position representing an HBCU, being a graduate of an HBCU, serving as a faculty member in the Criminal Justice Department, as well as the director of the Office of Civic Engagement and Service Learning. So it is clear that our partnerships in the community are very important as we actually produce citizens that become change agents in the community. We're producing students that can make a difference, and especially at the age that we see community being impacted heavily. There are multiple community opportunities as far as our faculty is concerned. We are very involved in boards, very involved in developing programs and research that impact policy. And I know you asked a broad question, and I have a lot to say, and I'm sure I'll be able to have more to say during the conversation. But I just wanted to point out a few things as far as our university being intentional with partnerships and developing partnerships. One thing I can say, even as far as the office is concerned, I mentioned the Office of Civic Engagement. That's all things civic engagement. And so it can range from tutoring, dealing with homelessness, and definitely law enforcement. And law enforcement partnerships, we have provided internship opportunities, other engagement opportunities. And I know Chief Kelly, we've talked briefly prior to this conversation this morning, and we talked about some of the partnerships that we've had in the past, not only with the university, but moving students forward with internships and opportunities to actually engage with law enforcement and be that voice to the community or for the community in regards to issues that we face, actually serve as ambassadors. And so I'm going to follow the rules and be brief this morning as far as this question is concerned, and be able to really expound on some things later.
Mr. Brooks, would you like to take that question next, please?
Yes, going as far back as maybe, I'd say 7-8 years ago, into my career, obviously, I see pretty much everything that goes on in the community. If I don't see it, I hear about it. Oftentimes, I get the opportunity to meet the victims. I get to meet the people that are actually committing the crimes. But being able to formulate the gaps between what happens, why it happens, and who it actually affects is a uniqueness about my position. It is one of the things that motivated me to even start a nonprofit organization. We started out doing things one way, and it just led to more and more and more. One of the 2 words that you'll hear communicated today is community partnerships. Dr. Davis mentioned it, Dr. Brown mentioned it, and that's pretty much the basis of our organization. How do we formulate these community partnerships to translate over what is being done, what can be done, who understands it, and directly who it affects? My biggest passion is young people. Mentoring has become one of the key elements of the group theory. We just finished up a pilot program where we're talking about career mentoring. But throughout the day, throughout the week, throughout the months, and every year, as a barber, I get to do that every day. So the uniqueness about that is my community partnerships range from just having a random conversation to being able to formulate a relationship with the police department here, traveling to Las Vegas to witness what the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department is doing there with their community partnerships. Also being able to travel to the White House and be a witness to what the Obama administration was doing with their 21st century community policing policy. So we've been able to come together and actually spread some of those things and ideas. So that's the unique part about what we're doing.
Great. Okay, Colonel McNeill.
Thank you, Director, and good morning. First of all, I'd like to thank FSU for extending the invitation to us and allowing us to be here. I'm most grateful for the outstanding leadership that Governor Cooper provides for us and to extend an invitation for us to all be here to participate, and the great leadership that Secretary Hooks provides to us in our Department of Public Safety. With the North Carolina State Highway Patrol, we're in all 100 counties, and so we wouldn't be able to do what it is that we do, providing law enforcement services, without maintaining outstanding relationships with our sheriff's departments, our police departments, our SBI, all of our partners here in North Carolina. Both of my colleagues that spoke before me mentioned partnerships. Within the State Highway Patrol, we have something called Traffic Safety Information Specialists in our PIO office. We're trying to be in schools, partner and educate the public about what it is that we do. Everybody sees the enforcement piece of the State Highway Patrol, but it's that community outreach that we do where we try to educate the public about safe driving habits and, building relationships. So we've mentioned, you've heard it before, the only way we can do what we do is through partnerships. The public plays a key and important role in the partnerships that we have in our state. With more than 10.4 million North Carolina residents, we couldn't do what it is that we do without partnerships and the compliance with the enforcement piece of what we try to do. So I'm honored to be here. Look forward to having this awesome conversation with this panel. Thank you, ma'am.
Great. All right, Chief Kelly.
In an attempt to not to regurgitate what's already been said, first I'd like to thank my home, Fayetteville State University, for hosting this event. But we talked again about partnerships. Dr. Davis has an excellent memory. I was the recruiter for the police department, and she remembered having conversations about how we can better recruit minorities within the department. But those partnerships with our local universities, and not just HBCUs, but we have Methodist College here and Fayetteville Technical Community College. But people like Kevin Brooks, who does a lot for this community, and to have him in an effort with us to gain the respect and understanding and partnership with the community is invaluable. But we have programs, I could talk for my allotted 2 minutes just about programs alone, but when we talk about diversion programs, like Colonel McNeill said, there's a lot of pieces to law enforcement agencies that we probably could do a better job of advertising on the things that we do to connect with the community. So things like diversion programs where we try not to lock up folks every time they violate a crime, but get them help that they need to get their lives back on track. Good people make bad decisions sometimes, and we have to realize that. But it's those partnerships with the court system, with the sheriff's department, with the highway patrol, with universities, with high schools, that helps us get the message out that, by doing things as a team, we can accomplish, a lot.
Okay. Pastor Rowden.
Thank you so much, and I too am grateful for the vision of our governor to put together such a vision for people that include faith-based organizations, and the partnership in our community with faith-based is vitally important. Secretary Hooks said 3 words in his opening statement that are very key and foundational in the faith-based community. He said healing, reconciliation, and love. Certainly our nation needs healing. Our communities need healing. And in order for our communities to be healed, there's a great need for reconciliation. But before we can reconcile, it's going to take love. So I'm very grateful with faith-based because law enforcement and those in the community are pretty much part of some faith-based organization. They're attending some church, synagogue, mosque. Likewise, for the person that's in the community. So here we have a law enforcement officer out doing law enforcement, and we have those in the community who are part of faith-based communities. So it's very important, I believe, for faith-based. And I'm wondering if we ever stop and think about it when we're out there as law enforcement or out there as a citizen, that we're together in this. You know, whatever your faith is, faith-based is vitally important. So I'm grateful today that we're able to talk about how we partner. Is very important because we, as faith-based, we're in the community and we interact with law enforcement sometimes more than other citizens. So it is very important for faith-based in the partnership.
Okay. Thank you. Major Peterson.
Good morning. Again, I would like to thank Governor Cooper for allowing us to do this. I thank Secretary Hooks for bringing this to Fayetteville, and I thank Fayetteville State for hosting it for us, because I think it's very important that we, as law enforcement officers and other agencies, other entities, come together and talk about the problems, because we are a part of the community. Every deputy that lives in Cumberland County has an interest in Cumberland County, and even those that live out of county. But we have to work with the community, and the Cumberland County Sheriff's Office does that in several different programs that I'm sure we'll discuss later on in this conversation. But again, I appreciate being here, and I will do my best to provide you with everything that you need to know and the public needs to know about the Cumberland County Sheriff's Office and what we do.
Thank you, sir. Okay, Director Schurmeier.
Well, I'm humbled to be here with such esteemed colleagues, and I'm humbled also to be here representing the men and women of the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation. We're the state's preeminent criminal investigative agency, and as such, we're called upon to investigate all fatal and non-fatal shootings involving law enforcement across the state that involve serious injury. So as we began to understand the aftermath of George Floyd and began to understand the trends we saw in North Carolina, we brainstormed and came up with the concept of developing a center for the reduction of use of force to try and find ways to stem the tide of use of force across our state. And we engaged, when it comes to the community, we engaged representatives throughout the state, including people like the North Carolina ACLU, the North Carolina Conference of DAs, the NAACP, El Centro Hispano, the National Alliance for Mental Illness, Conservatives for Criminal Justice Reform, the North Carolina Office of Indigent Defense Services, the North Carolina State Bar, and so on and so forth. So we affirmatively engaged the community throughout the state and engaged partners that we typically didn't partner with a lot. And we've already had 3 meetings. We're going to have a series of additional meetings, but we're optimistic we can come up with some solutions to stem the tide. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Now for a question that that's somewhat difficult to ask, but we're here to talk about building partnerships and that help our communities be safer. But there's clearly a lack of trust between some communities of color and law enforcement. My question is, and I'll ask Pastor Rowden first, what measures work best to build or rebuild that trust and promote a collaborative relationship between law enforcement and the communities they serve?
I believe one of the things is keeping open dialogue. And we see that conversations and the dialogue about the heart of the matter is vitally important. However, we have to get beyond just talking in the dialogue. There has to be action. I give an example when we talk about community policing. To me, I believe that when we put law enforcement in communities that they're familiar with and can relate to their socioeconomic challenges, that will help. And what I mean by that is I can remember growing up on the streets of Houston, how when I was a little boy, I could be standing outside and law enforcement would pull up and they would begin to talk to me. Hey, son, how was your day today? What did you do in school? I know we live in a different generation now, and it's unfortunate that you have little kids who are afraid of law enforcement. But we have to continue to talk about what things can we do better. And that's one of the things I believe is having open, serious dialogue. It hurts sometimes to talk about the things we talk about, but we have to talk about them, and we can't just leave it in the room after we talk about it. But there has to be continued action, substantive things that people can, because I hear it in the community a lot, oh yeah, that's all they're doing is talking, but they want to see results and what are you actually doing about it. Dr. Brooks, being in the environment that he's in, barbershop talk, if you would, he hear what people are saying. As faith-based, we hear what people are saying. So I believe that's important. It's not just continue to dialogue, but to also take action.
Okay. All right. Colonel McNeill.
Thank you for the question. I would say it begins with transparency and also the positive example or the example that your leadership sets for the organization. I'm very fortunate to be here representing the men and women of the North Carolina State Highway Patrol, but I'm also just most impressed with the leadership that I have in Mr. Secretary Erik Hooks, who believes in diversity and holds me accountable to make sure that we're in all types of communities to recruit, to showcase and share what the North Carolina State Highway Patrol is all about. Not just the enforcement piece, but the educational piece is just as important. But with regard to being transparent, when we make a mistake, and we often do, we have to own it. And we have to be the first ones as leaders representing our organization. I have a phenomenal command staff. We own when we make a mistake, and we have to be transparent. We also have to educate the public on what our policies are. Why we do the things that we do, the way we approach the car, the way we treat people throughout the interaction. We're trying to safely have our folks go home each and every night. But this forum is an opportunity for me to introduce this audience to our organization, and it begins and ends, as far as I'm concerned, is being transparent, having open and honest dialogue with the communities. And, each and every day, and, Director Walker, I know you get to see this each and every day, the public is always asking us for information, why we do what it is that we do. And we make sure that we respond to every last one of those requests for information, because we're no better if we can't be transparent and explain why it is we do what we do.
Thank you. Mr. Brooks, can you add to that, please?
I'd like to add to it, and I think it's a great question. I also think that we possibly, looking at where we are right now, what I would have said to this question 5 years ago is probably not what I would have said 3 years ago, and definitely not what I would say now is the same thing that of going back those years. So I feel like we should take a step back when it comes to law enforcement as well as community and acknowledge the fact that where did the distrust come from? Where is the lack of collaboration coming from? And you mentioned accountability and transparency, I think, and those things are very, very important. But we also have to be careful about, when we take a step back and look at those things, where we place the blame and the responsibility. Someone has to accept their role, and someone has to be the one to step up and say, I want to do something about that. And Pastor Rowden mentioned action. There has to be some action. What we saw over the last almost 7 months now is a call to action. And it got extremely difficult to watch. And I'm sure for some people it got extremely difficult to police or to try to figure out how to address what's going on in these streets. How do I address somebody throwing a rock through a window versus why they're actually out here feeling like they have to throw a rock through a window to get somebody's attention. So I feel like one of the bigger steps that we all can take towards building that trust is to acknowledge and then figure out how that action depicts that we did acknowledge.
Okay, thank you. The next question I have is for Chief Kelly. Please describe how your agency has taken steps to foster more positive relationships and help build that trust. And if you have any examples of specific programs that you want to share with us, please do so.
Yes, ma'am. So to piggyback off Colonel McNeill's comment, and it's funny how we know the answers to all these questions. All of us sitting here, and we'll probably, when we answer these questions, they'll be the same form or answer in one way, shape, or form. But we talk about transparency in the first place, and it hit law enforcement, I guess, like Mr. Brooks said, in the last 6 months with the unfortunate death of George Floyd and then COVID. So to try to reestablish our legitimacy and transparency during COVID is hard. To try to be close to one another and to interact with one another is hard with COVID, and then you got these pent up frustrations and feelings. So it's difficult now more than ever to build or rebuild a relationship for some and build relationships for others. But we do things like a movie night. It's a simple movie in a community to where we engage with the community and just talk about nothing, to get to know one another on a personal level. Law enforcement has this distinct inability to show themselves as human. We're not robots, but we don't portray ourselves as humans. So to have just conversation, a movie night and just have popcorn and talk about the movie or the weather in Puerto Rico, who knows? Just have a conversation to get to know you, to build trust, and to know that I will be transparent if something, when we make a mistake, like Colonel McNeill said, not if, but when. And to you to trust me enough that I'm going to give you the correct answer, the honest answer. But you have to build those relationships. We had an event last week called Faith in Blue where we teamed up with the religious community to go out in the neighborhoods, and we let the religious community ask the community what they needed from us. And we cleaned up a neighborhood. We had a raw community conversation with leaders within the community about police community relations. And we had a toy drive, and we gave toys back to the community. We have stuff like the PAL program, educating kids on gun violence. I can go on and on and on about the programs that the police department has, but they're all geared towards interaction, personal interaction between the community and law enforcement.
Okay. Major Peterson.
Yes, ma'am. We have to build trust. The public, in order for us to do our job, we have to have trust. The public has to trust us enough to believe that we're doing the right thing. Will we make mistakes? Yes. And when we make those mistakes, just like the Colonel said and others, we have to own up to them. And the more the public see that we do own up to our mistakes and try to correct them, the more that they believe in us. We in the Cumberland County Sheriff's Office, we have programs where we get out, like Dr. Brooks, we'll get out with the backpack and work with him and the kids. We get out in the public and communicate with them the things that we do in the Sheriff's Office. But we also invite them into the Sheriff's Office. We have a program whereby we have a Citizens Academy where the public can come in, and it runs for about 6 nights. And they can see exactly what we do on a daily basis. We have ride-along programs where people can ride along with the Cumberland County Sheriff's Office to see what we do. Our community police unit, the entire agency is a community police unit. We believe in getting out in the public. one of the worst things we can do is close ourselves off from the public by sitting in that car day in and day out and not engaging the public. So I require the people to get out. The sheriff required the deputies to get out, talk with the public, communicate with them. And these things are logged in so that we know that they're being done. And that's one of the ways that we try to build trust with the community and their trust in us. Thank you.
Thank you. This next question, I'm going to turn to Dr. Davis. If you will, tell us what role the college and college students can play in affecting positive change in the interactions between law enforcement and the community.
Okay, thank you. We've talked about quite a bit this morning, and I've heard the panelists mention a number of things that are important to developing those relationships and as far as the role that higher ed or students can play with producing positive change. There are several key things that I heard, and transparency is one, and I'm sure we will continue to talk about transparency. The community has talked about transparency, but transparency to those that would avail the students with information, the college or institutions with information to develop strategies. Transparency as far as information, what is happening, not only transparency but empathy. Specifically, how can the college play? But we're producing citizens. And when we look at the history of our students, even if you go back, students have been the forefront of change for many years. Even if we look back at the Greensboro Four, SNCC with John Lewis. Our students serve as ambassadors, and we are preparing our students to be change agents in the community. We are preparing our students to be civically engaged. Our students are in preparing our students to be civically engaged, these students not only serve as the ambassadors, but these students can carry back information or be that liaison to their peers and to their families. Not only can we foster these students to become ambassadors and change agents, but developing partnerships with law enforcement agencies or with law enforcement through internships. Not only through internships, I heard mention of an internship possibility or opportunity for students, even in regards to this particular issue. Not only internships, but jobs, providing jobs, making the seat available for our students to be at the table to discuss these issues. Not only that, but being the liaison as far as the university with partnerships, even with open houses where we may develop programs where law enforcement have open houses for our students, not only our students, but faculty. There are a number of things that, or roles that we can serve as a university that will help improve the relationship or be impactful. One thing that I also wanted to mention is that I heard Reverend Rowden mention conversation. And the community, a lot of times, are tired of hearing about conversation because they want to see action. And not only action, but after implementation. They want to be heard. And when we talk about conversation or dialogue, I would say this morning we're having conversation. But we would like to foster something beyond conversation, and that is deliberate dialogue. And with deliberate dialogue, those are steps. That's acknowledging who we are, being empathetic to the population that's most impacted. Not only being empathetic, but I mentioned earlier, transparent. So with that being said, not only deliberate dialogue beyond this conversation, but actually seeing action in implementation and using some of the expertise, not only from our students or us facilitating our students learning, but from experts in the field, providing evidence-based information, data, research that help impact policy and programs.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Brooks, you mentioned that your passion is young people. So how do you help foster that community partnership?
I think when it comes to young people, the answer is fairly simple. And I'm a simple-minded person. Obviously, I don't have any degrees of my constituents here on this panel, and but I do have a degree in how people think and how people operate. We need to get extremely younger. We need to go ahead and start talking to children as young as second grade and third grade, not just about law enforcement and what law enforcement does, but in specific duties of the community and how that translates over to what we think should come after that. Whether it's, if you do this, should that involve law enforcement? What kind of punishment does that look like? It doesn't always have to involve somebody in a uniform. When it comes to students, I think internships, like Dr. Davis mentioned, kids don't know about careers in law enforcement. Most of the times they know about policing, the act of policing. They don't know about that, but I think it should be widespread. And I also think we should be careful about keeping this thing looking at one community over the other. Oftentimes we talk about the black and brown communities, but there's another community that most of us know somebody that exists in, and it has nothing to do with color. It's socioeconomically deprived. It's the poor people, the people that don't have a lot of money, don't have an idea, because they don't have money, what career opportunities present themselves. I don't know if it takes a college degree to be a police officer. I don't know if it takes a college degree to become a dispatch officer. I don't know any of those things, but those are ways that we can do it. Look at what children are doing now. What are their biggest interests? Their interests are video games, YouTube, computers, laptops, and cell phones. And those are the same, that's the same equipment that's used in law enforcement. I don't think kids understand it if they walk into a control room at a police department that they'll see all these lights and buzzes, and it may spark some sort of interest to them. So talking to them about the technological ways they can be involved through their video games, through the STEM program, through biology, they can connect with law enforcement. There's a crime lab. So there's plenty of ways that we can introduce children into the law enforcement career without looking at it from a standpoint of policing. So therefore it becomes a balance. I'm a barber by trade, and I deal with people, but when I'm not barbering, I'm dealing with people about the conversations that I have as a barber. So the uniqueness, again, about me is that I get to see the whole gamut of it all. And then I have to go and get in my car, and all of a sudden I'm a black man, and I'm driving down the street and witnessing the same thing, the same apprehension. Pastor Rowden mentioned fear. You know, I think there's a problem if a child fears law enforcement. I think it's a huge problem if they do that, but I think it's an even bigger problem if they have a dismissal when they see law enforcement.
Okay. Yes, sir.
One of the things I've experienced, even in this community, when we talk about young people and what law enforcement is doing to try to engage and try to really protect our youth in a traffic stop, for example. And I can remember when there were videos and things out about what you shouldn't do, you know, stay in the vehicle, don't jump out of the vehicle, be polite, and these things. But it's up to us as well to teach our young people as well that these are things we should do. And the reason why I say this, want to intervene, because I would hear some that say, oh, that's just another way that they want to control us. No, that's a way to keep you and the officer safe. So it goes both ways. And as a faith-based leader, it's my responsibility to talk to my young parishioners and young people in the community that, no, this is not to control you, it's to help you. So these are the kind of things that we have to tweak maybe in law enforcement, say, well, maybe we can present it another way, because presentation is everything, especially for young folk and the parent as well. The parent plays an important role to encourage children. I hear it more so now, you know, from celebrities even saying, well, I have children that I'm afraid when they go out, these things happen, and I tell them, make sure you do A, B, C, and D. And they're the exact things that right here in our community we try to say to young people or to anyone, these are the things that will help, not that anyone's trying to control you. I wanted to add that.
Okay. Yes.
We believe in reaching the public through the young folk. We go out and do career days in the various elementary schools, middle schools, and even high schools. And we come out to the colleges as well to mentor to the young folk so that they don't see us all the time in a law enforcement role. Yes, we have on a uniform, but we're people as well. And the young folk, if we get them to respect us, they will grow up that way. But they also go back and talk to their parents and tell their parents their interactions with us in the school that day, and it grows from there.
Sir. The next question I'll give to Director Schurmeier. What are you doing to recruit a diverse workforce in the SBI?
We've come up with a diversity and inclusion plan that begins with an internship program to engage historically black colleges and universities throughout the state. We're also encouraging and developing a plan to provide leadership training for the agents within the SBI. So women and minorities are going to be promoted and given additional training, and we found within the SBI that the internship program is a great way for us to recruit and ultimately promote a diverse workforce. So we've got a plan in place. It's got 5 objectives to it, but the internship program and leadership training and mentorship are 2 of the pivotal things.
Okay. Chief Kelly?
Thank you, ma'am. So I'm just have real talk for about 2 minutes. I think the time limit is, and Mr. Brooks and I have an advantage over everybody else because we talk every Thursday at 1 o'clock about this topic or these topics, but we talk about diversity, and I'll bet you $100 to a donut, Colonel McNeill will agree. We want good quality people who have empathy, who care about people, and who will do the right thing. So we get caught up when, of course you want to have a law enforcement agency that depicts its community, but I'd rather have good people with good hearts and good intentions that will do the right thing, that will represent Colonel McNeill, Major Peterson, or myself, or law enforcement as a whole throughout this city, county, state, and nation, so where we don't pay the price for one bad apple. We get caught up on being, diverse, but we want to be diverse in the fact that we have good people with good intentions and doing the right thing. We go out to the colleges and universities, but you're fighting a perception of law enforcement that we've never seen before. And to go out and recruit minorities is extremely difficult. But Mr. Brooks says at the beginning is that a kid has to understand that it's an option. The Fayetteville Fire Department had an issue with diversity some years ago, and I stood up trying to help the fire chief out because he was getting beat up pretty bad about his lack of diversity. But I never knew an option to be a fireman. Didn't want to, but didn't know I didn't want to because no one ever showed me that option to be a fireman. So I think we're desperate right now in law enforcement to have good quality women and men in this profession. And so right now we just want good people.
Colonel McNeill, do you have anything to add?
Yes, ma'am. I hate to go back to leadership, but again, it starts with your leadership. And for me, Mr. Secretary, he holds me accountable for making sure that we have a plan in place for underutilized populations. And to your point, and ma'am, to your point, the North Carolina State Highway Patrol, we're hiring. The Department of Public Safety, we are hiring. So there's not a profession that exists here in North Carolina that in DPS we don't have a job to be able to put people in and to put them to work. But recruiting is extremely, extremely important to me. But you also have to know and understand your history. For the North Carolina State Highway Patrol, we began in 1929, and the first 40-plus years of existence didn't include people that look like me. And so we have had our work cut out for us since day one, being a minority working within the State Highway Patrol. But it goes to your leadership. You know, what you as leaders make be a priority is what your folks will work towards. Our director of training is responsible for our recruiting efforts. We have a minority recruitment plan. We have minority recruiters spread throughout the organization. Every job fair, we have a high school internship program. We have a college internship program, and we're trying to be in schools just as often as we can be. You know, with the pandemic, it has impacted how we're able to be in schools with the school closures. We do something called school safety checks. They're very simple. Our state troopers, we just want them to show up in any school, check out and walk around and just be seen and to build relationships. Last year, under Major Conley, who's here and present with me now, under his leadership, we performed more than 19,000 of these school safety checks last year. Each one of those checks, me included, I did several myself. There were numerous opportunities for us to introduce ourselves to the public and to build relationships. I am a North Carolina state trooper because as a child I met a state trooper. And that interaction was positive and it was favorable for me. And we have numerous state troopers that have joined our organization because of a favorable and positive interaction that they had with a state trooper as a young adult.
Thank you. Well, we've been talking about recruitment and recruiting a diverse workforce. Major Peterson, I'm going to ask you this question. How has the unrest that's been happening across the country impacted recruiting?
Thank you, ma'am. It has impacted recruiting, but it has ebbs and flows, meaning it's like when 9/11 kicked off. You had a lot of people running to the military, wanting to help this country. Well, in recruiting, since everything has occurred with the shootings and whatnot, George Floyd, we have our highs and our lows. It does impact it, but our recruiters get out and try to show a positive aspect of law enforcement, especially minorities. But it's sometimes difficult because of the image that people have of law enforcement, but we are still able to get good qualified people, and we have plenty of jobs for them.
Yes, sir.
I was talking to one of my youth at our church. He's 16 years old, and we were talking about possibilities when he graduated from school. And we were talking about different professions. And I mentioned to him, I said, what about law enforcement? He said, oh, no, you know, and it's because of the climate. And I began to tell him a lot of the things that law enforcement involves in with. He said, I didn't know they did that. All he see is what's in the news or what's going on in the community. So yes, it does impact recruiting, but that goes back to what we talked about, partnership. Me as a faith leader, what role do I play to do just that, to let people know, no, it's not that bad. There's better in your life. Colonel mentioned he had a great experience with Highway Patrol. As a youth, I had a great experience with the law enforcement that come by and just talk to me. But now kids, you know, say, well, they're not coming by asking me how was my day. They're coming by asking me, why am I standing out here? So again, I'm glad we're having these conversations, but what do we do when we leave the room? How do we have an impact on our youth?
Okay. Yes.
One of the things, and Dr. Hughes said the same thing, you know, again, I'm going to go back to leadership. Mr. Secretary is here because he is passionate about this committee that he's assigned to on this task force, the recommendations that conversations such as this that take place, this is not the only conversations that are being had. They've had numerous virtual town hall meetings, and he's put it into place recommendations that come from meetings such as this. So, I'm glad we're having the conversations. Please, if you got recommendations to make things better, he's here, he's present, and he welcomes those things. But can I go back to one of your points? We're hiring, and we want to have people from various communities to come and be a part of the State Patrol. We cannot be better if we are not a diverse and inclusive organization. So as you interact with young folks, please let them know. State Highway Patrol, we're hiring, and we want to put people to work. But
the colonel, not the recruiter. He's the recruiter today.
Hey, all state troopers are always recruiters. But I also mentioned to you, do you know we have a doctor that works on the Highway Patrol, or doctors? Do you know we have nurses? Do you know we have mechanics? We have pilots. We have numerous, like I said, there's not a profession in our Department of Public Safety that we don't have. We have engineers. And so young folks, the sky is the limit. It's just not police work wearing a uniform going and to arrest folks. We have multifaceted. Mr. Director has labs and all kinds of technicians, bomb technicians, canines. The sky is the limit. Pilots, so we're very diverse in the number of and the types of jobs that we have available to our public, and this forum gives us an opportunity to showcase them.
Mr. Brooks said we also have lots of information technology people too, people that do social media, so all kinds of opportunities within our department.
And if I can just add briefly to that, it's all about perception. It's all about perception. When I'm talking to young people and we start talking about careers, we start talking about, I specifically mention law enforcement because of what's been going on over the last several months. I want them to be able to talk about that and understand that you have a future. And my mom reminds me of this now more than before, but you have less years ahead of you than you do behind you when you get to a certain age. And these kids have to understand that it is going to require your input. And you can start right now. I'm talking to children as young as 13 years old. And I need them to know exactly what you said. And so it's easier for me to say it. It's something else for it to be backed up when I introduce them to it. And that's what the role, I think, is outward of me.
Thank you. Well, we're at approximately the hour mark, and so we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back in approximately 5 minutes. I will say to anybody that's watching and you have a question that you feel like you want someone on this panel to answer, please email us at events@ncdps.gov. That's events@ncdps.gov. You may also find on our website a way to log in, and you can ask your question virtually. We'll take about a 5-minute break, and we'll be right back. Okay. Thank you for coming back with us, for those that have rejoined the forum, and we're going to get right back to it. So one of the questions that has come up quite often with the racial justice and racial inequities task force and those committees has to do with SROs. Major Peterson, I'm going to put you on the spot. Talk to me a little bit about SROs and how do you feel they are helpful or not in the communities, in the school setting?
Okay, we have SROs in all of the high schools, the middle schools, and the majority of the elementary schools. And they seem to be working very well. It's a very good program. They interact with the students. They, on a weekly basis, teach a class, letting them know what law enforcement is all about. Now, they are in schools for crimes being committed in the schools, okay? But like Chief Kelly said, we have a diversionary program that, depending on what the crime is, we try to use that program to help that student, because we don't want to cause students to get criminal records, because once they get a criminal record, their career is pretty much over in some jobs, in certain jobs. So the program itself has been very valuable to the sheriff's office to be able to interact with the students, to let them know what law enforcement is really all about, that we're not always out there running and gunning and arresting people. So I recommend it.
Okay. Chief Kelly?
Quickly to that, to Major Peterson's point of the importance, as a Fayetteville police officer, I'm jealous that we don't have SROs, because Major Peterson made a point is that he has an opportunity, and we do too in downtime, whenever that is, but he has an advantage as it relates to interacting with kids because he has a deputy in the school, whereas local law enforcement usually doesn't. So it's important because he can become a mentor, and the kid don't even know he's being mentored by the deputy sheriff to build that relationship and understanding and get a better picture of what a police officer or deputy sheriff is.
Unfortunately, there's also been in the news media at times, there's been reports of situations where some people felt like maybe someone in that school resource officer role might have been a little bit heavy-handed. What, I don't know, Pastor Rowden or Dr. Davis or Mr. Brooks, have you heard anything like that? Do you hear from parents or young kids that have an issue with the person that is in their school?
I just think it's a case-by-case basis. It's a circumstantial basis. Again, perception. If we see, like you may have witnessed, a video of an SRO officer, he could be in Atlanta, Georgia, and does something, and those kids see that on social media, and they come back to school the next day, then he or somebody that from the Cumberland County Sheriff's Department may have to deal with that issue. So what does he do? What does that responsibility fall on the SRO officer here in Fayetteville, North Carolina? In some ways, yes, it does. And just like when a child is killed tragically outside of a school, we send people inside of the school to deal with grief counseling and all those types of things. If that's something that the SRO officer here in Cumberland County has to do, then I don't see why it should not stop him from doing it.
Pastor?
Yes, I was going to say, based on the question about SRO, and of course with Chief Kelly, he said he was jealous about not having that opportunity. But we do recall when there was a time when we had a program. I was fortunate enough to work as the community liaison in Cumberland County Schools. It's for Central Services, and they had a program called Every Minute Count. When there was a police officer assigned, that officer and I would go to homes, reference truancy, and it gave Fayetteville Police Office a great opportunity to interact not just with the kid but with the families, and I saw great results that came from that. So again, the interaction with the kids and the family, I think, is vital, and maybe not necessarily having something like that now, but that same kind of interaction, it did well. I witnessed on many occasions, we would go over to 450 homes in a year interacting with families, and I could see a difference. In fact, there was one time, it was a write-up in Fayetteville Observer, a mother who was anti-law enforcement, if you would, because of death of one of her family members, that was killed in an officer-involved shooting. But after myself and this law enforcement officer would interact at her home, she said that she had a whole different view. You said it a while ago, Mr. Brooks, is perception. When we can get in the community, and that's why I said earlier, it's important for law enforcement to be actively in the community to make an impact on a young colonel, future colonel, in their life in the community.
Okay. Sure.
And the SROs, they don't just stop at the end of the school year. The Cumberland County Sheriff's Office puts on a summer camp. We didn't do it this year, of course, because of COVID, but we do yearly a summer camp for these kids where the SROs continue to work with anywhere between 85 to 100 kids at various locations where they take them throughout the week to do different activities, just to let them know that they're human as well.
All right. I believe we do have a question. If First Sergeant Baker, if you want to.
So our first question is coming from Freddie Barnes, and he asked the entire panel, what is law enforcement doing differently in this BLM environment? Also, how are your agencies dealing with the issue of bias regarding the hiring of racial and gender ethnicities?
I'll take that. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Barnes, for your question. Law enforcement, not just here in North Carolina, but all throughout the country, we're having conversations about how can we be better. We all are reviewing our use of force policies. We all have mandated numerous types of training, a duty and responsibility to intervene, a duty and responsibility to take a complaint and to make sure that we act on it, and to be responsive as we possibly can. But one of the great things here in North Carolina, I mentioned earlier talking about transparency. I'll also talk about the importance of accountability. Here in law enforcement, here in our great state, we all take an oath of office if you are a law enforcement officer. Our power arrives from the very people that we serve. They are the jurors that sit in all of our court cases, and they are responsible for giving all of us our power. With regard to accountability, from the two chiefs associations, the sheriff's association, working with the patrol, I get to work with these great leaders day in and day out, and I know that they all believe in holding our folks and their folks accountable. We also have an excellent working relationship with our Conference of District Attorneys. We're in partnership with all of them. And then I'm honored that we have Director Schurmeier here present. With the patrol and these other agencies, when we have an officer-involved shooting, we don't investigate ourselves. We contact the State Bureau of Investigation. They come in and they conduct an investigation, which is criminal. When we do our internal investigation, it's administrative. So our personnel are being held to two standards when they're involved in an incident that does harm and may have resulted in a loss of life. So we're very proactive. This current movement gives us an opportunity, Mr. Barnes, to look at how it is we do our job, how we police, and the goal is to ultimately be better. This task force presents a way for us to do just that. to have open and honest conversations, to share best practices, to take that information and to grow and to be better.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'll jump in as well, and thanks, Colonel. We mentioned previously about the Center for the Reduction of Law Enforcement Use of Force, and I'll read just the very beginning part of the mission statement and then encapsulates the 4 objectives. But the mission statement says up front, the SBI Center exists to proactively develop, advocate, and support the implementation of evidence-based measures to reduce law enforcement use of force, and in doing so to enhance the safety of both the members of the general public and law enforcement officers. The objectives are real clear. Number 1, collect data, conduct behavioral and situational analysis, and produce applied research on the precursors and outcomes of law enforcement use of force. Number 2, promote training for law enforcement officers that will reduce the potential use of force within North Carolina and assure the mutual safety and well-being of members of the public and law enforcement. Number 3, we've talked about this before, promote transparency, mutual understanding, and public engagement related to law enforcement use of force. And the last one, pursue collaborations and partnerships with law enforcement partners, higher education institutions, and community organizations. So I'd say that one of the critical things involving use of force is data. Do you have good data? And is it standardized? And right now across North Carolina, we don't have standardized reporting. We don't have a uniform way of reporting the use of force. So what we've talked about, and I don't want to jump ahead of the work of the center, but what we've talked about is standardizing the reporting of use of force and collecting that data so that we can have accurate data, and then creating perhaps a public dashboard where the community can go on there and begin to study use of force across the state or within their community. So that's it in a nutshell. Thank you.
Yes, Chief Kelly.
Also to add, we talk about bias. Law enforcement agencies, particularly ours, do a lot of bias training, racial intelligence training. But I think it's important that, so this panel is pretty much comprised of law enforcement. We have higher education and religious, but we don't have a conversation because it's all inclusive as it relates to bias. But law enforcement finds itself having to answer these questions, whereas bias is all over society. But we need to have the conversation to where is the bias in the educational system? Where is the bias in the economic system? Where is the bias in the mental health system? Law enforcement is willing to have the conversation about bias and understand that there is bias within its ranks. But this needs to be a community-wide conversation, because a lot of the problems that law enforcement deals with started a long time ago as it relates to someone's life and where they may have been derailed based on a bias. So they don't have the same economic opportunities, educational opportunities that someone else may have, and they end up in the law enforcement system. But we all, as a society, has to talk about biases. The community has to talk about biases as it relates their biases against law enforcement. So we have to have the communication now has to go from law enforcement recognizing that we have issues. We have issues, right? But then now everybody else has to understand and recognize that we have issues. Now, how do we fix those issues? So we can have bias training all day long, but if the collective parties don't come together and acknowledge their biases, you're just going to have a one-sided conversation.
The part that I would add to that is there was the acronym mentioned in the question was BLM. So we're talking about the Black Lives Matter movement. Some people call it a protest. Some people call it a riot. Again, which is indeed pointing out how we view certain things when we hear certain words merged together, or when we see something on TV or on video or witness it in our own personal experiences. We can sum that up in the word value. We're talking about value. Do I value my life? Do you value your life? Do we value our lives the same? Do we value law enforcement life? Do we value the life that the law enforcement has to live in order to function in their job? Does law enforcement have enough information to be aware of what it looks like when somebody's walking down the street and judging them based off of what they have on versus where they're coming from versus how fast they're walking, if they're jogging, if they're walking with a group of people, if they're walking with their girlfriend, what time of day it is, all those things. So I agree with you, Assistant Chief Kelly, about the biases. And everybody needs to find some sort of way to reckon with their biases, reconcile with their biases. Again, going back to a word that was used earlier. But when we have spent so many months watching protests and so many answers and so many ideas that are being thrown and tossed around all across this country about what we should do and what we should take into account to not only address the issues that we have across the board with law enforcement in our communities, but how do we fix this? And we talk about it all the time about just how broad that problem is, from judges all the way down to recruits to be law enforcement. So there has to be a sort of accountability that people can believe in, some sort of accountability that people can trust, and not only that, something that we can also invest in by being a part of that solution, by getting more people to be a part of that solution. Taking the role that I've taken to address and work with and talk to the police has not always been favorable by my immediate community. But my fear and my concern is if I do not do that. So we need more people to feel that way, and the people need to feel that the law enforcement will in turn reciprocate whatever efforts we put out from the community to show that the value is such that Black Lives Matter.
Dr. Davis, I was going to come to you next. I was going to ask you about what are your students saying about that, and what advice do you give them when they talk about this topic?
Okay, there's a lot to be said when we talk about implicit bias. And I see you laughing, but there's a lot to be said. And in fact, I'm going to step out and say that implicit bias is really just the new word to discuss this issue of systemic racism. And it goes beyond law enforcement. When we talk about the criminal justice system, we're including law enforcement, courts, and corrections. And unfortunately, our young people are and have been impacted heavily in those areas as far as the criminal justice system. And some of it is not some of it, but research has shown that implicit bias is real. And when we talk about implicit bias, we're talking about unconscious biasness. And each and every one of us on the panel this morning, we can say we have no biases. But I'm sure Chief Kelly may be familiar with the IAT survey and others as well. Surveys similar. You take those surveys and you find out that you do have some biases, and those unconscious biases do impact how you interact with citizens, how law enforcement officers interact with those individuals they may come into contact with. And just like Mr. Brooks mentioned earlier, it may be because of how they appear, how they dress, just a lack of understanding of an individual. And I know you asked one question very quickly. For an example, many years ago, I worked in the field myself for 15 years prior to becoming involved with higher ed. I served as a probation officer, and I also served as a criminal justice planner that really looked at issues in society and looked at what are the problems we're facing and tried to develop solutions for that. And what I want to say, even as a young person, at that time I was 21 years old, beginning to work in the system, and even I was told, before you interview for this position, you need to make sure that you change the look, because you appear to be a threat. You have natural hair, you are of a darker skin tone, you are female, etc. And these are the things, unfortunately, 20 years later, these are the things that our students, that I'm hearing from our students in regards to some of the biases that they face. So are they experiencing them? Yes. Today? Yes. What can we do about it? We've had to move beyond the conversation. Chief talked about training, and we can train and train and train. But what do you do with training? When you start a new job, what do you have? You have a certificate of training. We may forget what we've learned. So on top of training, it requires some reinforcement, some supervision. So, and I see the 30 seconds, but with supervision, then we're able to identify. Then what do you do when you see that behavior? Because with supervision, you're looking for that specific behavior. So am I hearing that from students? Do students talk about that? Yes.
Sorry, I don't see where I could add this in here, so I'll add it quickly. So one of the things that I think law enforcement needs to do a better job at is that as it relates to their efforts to interact with children or the citizens. So we have a tendency to identify problem children, right? So when we identify with problem children, we're exposing our officers, let's just say, the worst of the worst. We never expose our officers to the good kids. We leave them out. We have programs and camps, I'm just gonna say it, for bad kids. But we're showing our officers that a certain demographic is bad all day long. So we need to do it better to introduce ourselves, and society can do a better job introducing us to the good ones. So those interactions will help law enforcement officers see another side of who we deal with on a daily basis.
Can I say something very quick?
Sure.
Interaction, not after the fact. Not after, early on.
And I believe there's a positive to that, not necessarily negative, by not exposing them to the good thing, you know. And I'm not preaching, Colonel. Jesus said, you know, that those who are not sick don't need a doctor. The ones that are sick are the ones in need of a doctor. And I'm paraphrasing. So I believe, just me having worked in the school system for years and being in the community, that yes, those programs for what we say are the troubled kids is much needed. But in essence, we do things for the good kids. I see other programs when you go in the community and doing different things. Adopt a cop. I mean, the kids in the school system. So I believe it's still a positive thing and not necessarily bad. I'm not sure if that's how you meant it. That, you know, why aren't we doing anything for the good kids? I think we do, but maybe not as on the level that we do for those who need attention more.
And Chief Kelly, you said something that sparked a question for me. How do you think that's impacted how your officers interact with the public?
Well, I can only go by 26 years of experience in law enforcement and the fact that it's negative. I believe if, I don't have time to give you analogies that I always use, but if you always show someone something bad, they will believe that's bad. And I think, so I'll give you an example. Went to a homicide a few years ago. It was 5 people shot, 3 dead, 1 wounded, hiding behind the house with 2 people hiding them. 1 went to the hospital. So I'm the highest ranking person there at the time, and I'm the only minority officer there at the time. And I could see everybody looking at me like, what's wrong with your people? So, but that's all they see. So I think to your question, I think it impacts officers negatively if you only see negative parts of society.
Major Peterson, can you add to that? How do you think that what's going on in the community and across the country today, do you think that's had an impact on how your deputies interact with the public?
Well, it does, and just like the chief said and like everyone else has said, we need to train, but we have to have more than just training. Like the doctor said, we have to do reinforcement on that. And it does impact them if you're exposed to bad all the time. And basically, that's what law enforcement is exposed to, bad all the time. You don't need us for the good people. we deal with people that society do not want to deal with. And so it does make officers think a certain way. And they begin to think that all of them are bad. They'll look at a community and say the entire community is bad, and it's not. It's not. And so with training and reinforcement, talking, panels like this, that's the only way we're going to be able to change it.
Colonel, do you have anything to add to that when your troopers stop someone on the roadway? That unknown of the person in the vehicle, have you seen a change? Have some of your younger troopers come to you and said, I'm not sure I can continue doing this?
Well, it is a difficult, very, very difficult time to be in the law enforcement profession. But I cannot think of, just like Mr. Secretary said earlier, of a more noble profession than to serve your fellow man and woman. I view all of our state troopers as being ambassadors. We represent our state, we wear our flag, and we're proud to be North Carolina state troopers. We just graduated 23 state troopers last Friday. And this school, everything that they had to go through with COVID-19, an exposure and an outbreak, and all the precautions that they had to go through, and their school was prolonged by 6 weeks, but they made it. They went through all of that just to, and while they were going through this last 7 months, all the protests and all the civil unrest that they had the opportunity to witness. But I'm just so grateful that we have people that still believe in the power of serving their fellow man and woman. And so, we have an awesome mission. It's a noble profession. And, I'm thankful for the men and women who get up every single day that are state troopers trying to make a difference here in North Carolina.
Come and talk to you about what's going on in the community and whether or not they, what they think. What are your answers?
Well, it's different. I have 4 brothers also, and I don't have any sisters. And I was raised by my mother. And I was raised across the dirt road from my grandmother. And my mom has 9 sisters and only 4 brothers. So for some reason, God has dominated my life around a bunch of women. So I've learned to be careful. And my oldest daughter, who's my twin, when the protest started here in Fayetteville, she made her signs without consulting me, and she went to watch the protest, from her words. And I said, well, if you're watching a protest, then put your sign down, because you're not standing in a position where people can see what you're saying. If you'd rather be in a position where people can see what you're saying, you represent you. Because if you go through that crowd, you'd be hard-pressed to find someone that thinks exactly like you, looks exactly like you, operates exactly like you. There's a lot of diversity with what's going on right now in the Black Lives Matter movement. As you can see now, you have maybe half the people out there are actually black. So yes, I encourage them to be involved in the extent of understanding why you're there. And every ounce of your word protest does not mean physically having to be in the street. But I would not stop my children from being involved. Nobody stopped me. As a matter of fact, nobody encouraged me when I was younger to be involved. And I've been involved like this ever since I can remember, maybe not in the same capacity. And that's why I try to tell people that there's no perfection. There's nothing better than you can do to pay attention to what's going on and have a voice. So the only thing that's gonna be perfect with what you're doing is your effort. And of course, I have a 18-year-old who's now in college. Fortunately, she's at an HBCU, and she'll get to see a different side of black life that she might not have seen in my own home. So there's diversity even in the communities that we're trying to diversify in. And with young people, the more you talk to them, the more you see that. So this Black Lives Matter movement and the whole entire process that we're trying to get to be a more open process is not even cookie. You can't just put it one side over here and one side over there. It's way different now. And another thing that United States needs to understand within itself is that you have a whole entire demographic of generation coming up behind you. You're not going to be able to look at things and look at it as so much as black and white, or black, white, and brown for that matter. So we need to get this problem and these problems addressed and fix as much as we can now, because there's a whole other generation coming up behind us, and we're not exactly sure what that's going to look like.
Okay. Anybody have anything to add? Pastor Rowden, your young parishioners, do they come to you and look for answers?
And not just the parishioners, but young people in the community. And I agree wholeheartedly with Mr. Brooks about the generation that's coming up. Sometimes we get tunnel vision and we're focusing on just what's in front of us, but not realizing the biggest problem that we have in America right now is a generational issue. And it's not going to change if we do not address generational issues. So, yeah, we talk about freedom of speech, and I find myself explaining to young people, freedom of speech don't mean you just say anything you want to say. You have to be careful, because it identifies you and who you are, maybe not in the right way. Like you said, that sign your daughter's holding up, all they see is that sign. They don't know the words or the feelings behind that sign. So I believe our youth are very important, and faith-based can have a positive impact with youth program. And I think law enforcement, because I don't know of a program that law enforcement here in Fayetteville have that they don't include faith-based. And we've been doing this long before, COVID, long before, the shootings and all, so we're grateful for the faith-based and the partnership we have with law enforcement here in Cumberland County.
Okay. My next question has to do with oversight of law enforcement agencies. And I want to ask the panel, what do you think about, or when do you think it's most appropriate for an outside entity to come in and either be a part of the policy making, or is it just after an event? When do you think it's oversight is needed?
I think I want to say immediately, but not with anybody and not with everybody. But law enforcement is the community. I think Colonel McNeill spoke about that earlier. All of the sheriffs live in the community, or they live in the county, or they live somewhere near it. We all have neighbors. So the whole thing of police looking like a totally different type of alienated people, and the community looking like I think that gap needs to decrease some. And I think that is what you mentioned about transparency. My idea of transparency may not be what somebody else's idea of transparency is. It's specifically in law enforcement. You have a job to do. At the end of the day, it's a job for everybody that's in law enforcement. So I don't know everything that goes along with Assistant Chief Kelly's job. I don't even know what goes on every day in Dr. Davis's job. But if this one incident is what's bringing us together, I think there's a sort of transparency that needs to happen, and that kind of an immediate, because of what we've seen over the last 7 months, if not over the last 45, 50 years.
Any of our law enforcement folks want to talk about outside oversight?
So we talk about outside oversight. That's a whole different dynamic. In law enforcement, I don't think any agency head is opposed to outside intervention, so to speak, like Mr. Brooks said, but it can't be any and everybody. But let's take it a step, let's say backwards a little bit, is that we have a tendency, and everywhere, we had a command staff meeting a few weeks ago, and we were talking about what our officers need or want as it relates to retention. And I just stopped and looked around the room, and a bunch of old people talking. We're making decisions for our future leaders and our officers, but they're not in the conversation. So I think we talk about oversight, and we're probably talking about as it relates to use of force and things of that nature. But I want to take it a step backwards, let's just say, let's ask citizens or society, what do you want out of law enforcement? You know, we assume we know what you want, but you tell us what you want and what you want us to be. So that's how I see intervention, outside intervention, is that tell us what kind of law enforcement agency you want, what's important to you, what's your priority, what's not your priority. And then you'll have, like Mr. Brooks said, perception. Perception is reality, is that you're doing what I want you to do.
Okay. Director Schurmeier?
Thanks. I agree with the panel here. I think that oftentimes it has to be community-based, and as you mentioned, it's you have to be careful here. You know, I've seen occasions where people chair boards that call police murderers behind the badge, and they're actually in a decision-making role. When that happens, what confidence can the police have that the community's supporting them? So I think it has to be community-based. I think it promotes transparency and accountability and addresses a lot of issues, but we have to be very, very careful that you don't bring in people that have a very biased agenda themselves.
Okay. Well, I think we're getting close to the end of time, and I want to give everybody an opportunity in case there's something that we haven't talked about that's that you want to make sure that we add to the conversation and actions that are taken. So I'll give each of you just about a minute, if you will, if there's something that you just want to make sure that you say before we go. Dr. Davis.
I'm just going to take this opportunity to somewhat continue responding to the previous question in regards to oversight, because I think that's very important. And when we talk about oversight, I think we need to be mindful that we're not talking about an effort that is necessarily reactive, because when we talk about intervention, I kind of hear reactive. So on oversight, yes, bringing in and being careful of who that entity is in regards to the oversight, but even if we're looking at including other entities such as community members outside of the councilmen, outside of the clergy, outside of law enforcement, but those individuals that are really familiar and understand some of the issues and needs of the community. So with the oversight, my response, I would say that is something that is needed, not necessarily as a reprimand, but something that exists there, and not just in a reactive nature for intervention, but prior to an issue that we see happening. And some of the issues that we see, some of the things we face today, unfortunately, we know that the media may sensationalize the issue. So that's what the public is seeing. But it's still there, it's still real, it still exists. And I think that is something that will be helpful, in addition to continue this conversation beyond just exchanging ideas and talking about it, but moving forward with action and implementation with deliberate dialogue.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Brooks?
I'm going to keep it to a minute. But in just, I think it's important that we understand from the community side. I'm going to speak from the community side. And I've heard this before, change your attitude, you change your altitude. I think my community needs to have, when I say my community, I don't just mean the black community, I mean the community that I deal with, that I work with, and it's various. But I think we need to change our attitude towards what law enforcement is and try to move to what we want it to be and what capacity we have to make that happen. It's okay to disagree. I've got my past of run-ins with law enforcement. Ironically, the nicest law enforcement I ever run into was a state trooper. So I didn't mean not to toot your horn, but it's just a fact. It's just a fact. And I was younger, and at the time I was going through different things with other types of law enforcement. Not that I was a criminal, but I was going through experiences with other types of law enforcement, and then when I had an experience with a state trooper, it was just totally different. So you take those experiences and you take into account for what they are. But in summing it up, I just want people to understand that disagreement does not mean that we disengage. We do not allow law enforcement to exist without our input. We do not allow law enforcement to exist without having some say-so, and we do not allow law enforcement to exist without asking for what you said, accountability, what we want to see, and that will require our involvement. And that's pretty much all I have to say.
Okay. Colonel McNeill?
Thank you again, ma'am. One of the just quick highlights that I'd like to just bring to everybody's attention, here in North Carolina, we have a criminal justice commission that serves, if you will, as an outside panel that holds all law enforcement here in North Carolina to very high standards. And when oaths of office are ever violated, that outside entity is responsible for holding people accountable with regard to their certification. And so I just wanted to share that. And then most of the law enforcement agencies that are represented here are also accredited. And with that accreditation, we have numerous high standards that we all have to meet in order to maintain that. One of those standards is having a mechanism in place to be able to file complaints. With the State Highway Patrol, through telephone, walking up to a state trooper, calling in, doing it anonymously by email through a DPS hotline. There are numerous ways for our organization to be able to receive feedback, good, bad, and indifferent. And so I just wanted to make those just 2 points of clarification and just share that information. But lastly, I'm most grateful for the invitation to be here, to be able to share just a little bit about my organization, and it's just an honor and a privilege to be here with my colleagues. Thank you.
Okay. Chief Kelly?
Secretary Hooks, I need you to take Colonel McNeill back with you because he come to Fayetteville to try to recruit. We are also hiring, and you don't have to leave Fayetteville or Cumberland County. So I'll put that out there. He thought he gonna get away with that, but I wanna be clear that this is good conversation and good dialogue, but I think it's highly important, and I'm no genius, that I think we bring all entities to the table. I think, as we should, we're holding law enforcement accountable, but we're not holding everybody else accountable. We're not holding other parts of our society accountable. I won't name them. You know what they are, but you have to, as citizens who vote and pay taxes, have to demand more from your public servants. So have everybody to the table, acknowledge their faults and what they can do better, and you demand that. The local Child Advocacy Center has a child fatality review board. When a child unfortunately dies, if a child drowns, all parts of society is represented. So each part of that board tells what they could have done better as a result of that child's death. So it's putting your feelings on that table. The school system says what they could have done better or what their interactions were, law enforcement, mental health, social services. All those folks take account of what they could have done better to have prevented that child dying from an unfortunate drowning, just say. So I think we do the same thing as relates to this thing we call bias, is that before, like Major Peterson said, before we get caught, because nobody's inviting us to the six-year-old birthday party to eat ice cream and cake, before they come into our interactions negatively, let's correct each step that a person or persons go through so that they don't become entangled in our criminal justice system, and we can fix this as a holistic approach. Thank you.
Okay. Pastor Rowden?
I would like to just close out by saying to those who are watching or who may be listening or watch or listen later on, that in order for us as a community to build the partnership and more so the trust between the community and law enforcement, is that we ourselves have to be more engaged. We ourselves have to make sure that we are trusted by the ones we're trying to get to trust someone else. Because if me as a pastor in the faith-based community, if the community don't trust me and I'm trying to get them to trust something else, it's for naught. And I'm not just saying with faith-based, but whoever we are, whatever capacity we are in our community, that we need to be engaged and involved, because I see a lot of people, when something happens, that's the only time they get engaged and don't have all the information. So please, ma'am, please, sir, who's watching and listening, be engaged and gain the trust from your community yourself. Thank you.
Okay. Major Peterson.
Thank you, and I'm really honored to be here today. We don't want all of our people to go to highway patrol, so we are hiring also, or to the city. we do have openings, so you don't have to go there. When you know better, you do better. And I think that when we have panels like this to educate us and to discuss things, we have to go out and make the change. We have to do better. And I'm committed to doing better, to do the things that I can to make this community, make my community a better place. And like the Colonel said, we too have avenues to report things to the sheriff. You can call the sheriff directly. You can email the Cumberland County Sheriff's Office, or you can just stop a deputy on the road and he will communicate with you and take your complaint. So if you have any problems, we're here to help you get through them. And thank you again for allowing me to be here.
And Director Schurmeier.
Congratulations to the panelists. What a great experience. I wrote a letter to the editor that I was surprised to get published, and I titled it, "We Will Do Better for Those We Serve." And I'll just read a couple of excerpts. Without question, what we saw occur with the death of Mr. George Floyd goes against every tenet of impartial justice and the very foundations of the law enforcement profession itself. This act was indefensible and criminal and does a great disservice to the many honorable and dedicated law enforcement professionals who serve our state and our nation and its many diverse communities. This is not representative of who we are and what we stand for. But we also must plainly acknowledge that this is not about a single incident in Minneapolis, no matter how tragic and how great a miscarriage of justice this act was. But rather, this is emblematic of a much larger and systemic issue of mistrust, misunderstanding, and fear by many people of color with respect to the very law enforcement professionals who are sworn to protect and serve them. As a profession, we must come to grips with this, and it must be addressed with the greatest urgency. This cannot continue. Collectively, law enforcement professionals and leaders must seek new and better ways to understand the root causes of use of force incidents and to better equip our law enforcement officers to de-escalate difficult situations and to employ minimum use of force to the greatest extent possible while preserving their own personal safety. This is not always an easy task in sometimes volatile and dangerous circumstances, but is incumbent on law enforcement professionals to continuously strive to do better for the citizens we serve, all of our citizens. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. And Mr. Secretary, if you will, close us out.
Thank you, Director Walker. Thank you to all our panelists who have joined together today, and thank you all who have tuned in virtually. This has been a tremendous experience for all of us here, and I hope for all of those who watched. I listened intently, and I was reflecting as I was sitting there. There are a couple of things that kind of resonate with me each and every day, being the Secretary of the Department of Public Safety and the Homeland Security Advisor for North Carolina. One, how do I go about every day to try to protect and create a better environment for 10.4 million people in North Carolina? And secondly, how do I obtain wisdom in doing that? I often lean toward Proverbs, seeking that wisdom. So, Pastor, keep praying for me, keep praying for us. And often I find that the wisdom is just coming together, not just for conversation, but deep collaboration. Again, we may not agree on every point, but the mission that we have, both as public servants and citizens in every community across North Carolina, requires us to do what's right for each and every person that we may touch. And so I'm humbled to be part of the noble profession of public safety. I'm humbled to be a part of various communities, and I'm honored to be a black man in North Carolina. No doubt, troubles and tribulation will come our way, but I know who I am and whose I am, and I try to impart that on every young person that I touch. And I want to encourage each one of you, never get weary on this long journey. I described it as a long journey, but as I said at the beginning, just like the arc that described by Dr. King, it bends toward justice. Thank you.
All right. Thank you again. Thank you for being here, all our panelists, and thank you for watching. And again, if anybody still has questions that were not answered here today, please, we'll continue to monitor the website, events@ncdps.gov. That's events@ncdps.gov, and please send in your questions or your suggestions, and we'll make sure that they get to the right people. Thank you.